I lost my job and my house overnight. I went to my daughter's house hoping to pass the night. She said, "Dad, my husband isn't comfortable having you here. We don't want the neighbors to know you are related to us." That night, I slept in my car. The next morning, an old friend called me. What happened next was rather unexpected. I will tell you everything. Before then, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story resonates with you, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time is it there. Let me take you back to the beginning. "Dad, my husband isn't comfortable having you here." She didn't whisper it. She didn't soften it. She stood half behind the door like I was a delivery she hadn't ordered, one hand gripping the frame, the other tucked into her sweater sleeve. My duffel bag sat by my feet, the zipper broken, one sock peeking out like it was embarrassed to be seen. She wouldn't meet my eyes when she added, almost as an afterthought, "We also don't want the neighbors asking questions. People talk." I remember the porch light buzzing above us, drawing moths in frantic circles, and thinking how strange it was that the light stayed on even when the warmth behind the door didn't. I had lost my job that morning, though lost felt too gentle a word for what had happened. The HR call had lasted less than 6 minutes. There was a script, a pause where they pretended to care, and then silence after I said I understood. By noon, my access badge stopped working. By mid-afternoon, the bank left a voicemail about the foreclosure paperwork I already knew was coming. I didn't cry then. I packed what mattered because that's what men my age were taught to do. Handle it quietly. Don't make it anyone else's problem. Going to my daughter's house felt like the last reasonable option, not desperation. Parents were allowed to lean once in a lifetime, weren't they? She kept talking, explaining logistics like they mattered. Her husband worked early. The house was small. The kids were asleep. She said all of it quickly, as if speed would make it kinder. I nodded because interrupting felt like begging, and I still hadn't learned how to do that. I told her I only needed one night, that I'd be gone before sunrise. I even joked that I'd sleep on the couch like I used to after late shifts when she was little. She smiled thinly at that, the way people do when nostalgia inconveniences them. That was when she said it, the part that lodged in my chest and stayed there. "We don't want people knowing you're struggling." I didn't argue. That surprised me later, how quickly I accepted it. I picked up the bag and told her it was fine, that I understood, that I didn't want to cause trouble. All of those words were true in the shallow sense, the way lies often are. She said she was sorry without sounding like she meant it, then closed the door with care, like the hinges might remember me. The lock clicked. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the wood grain, noticing a small chip near the handle I didn't remember from before. I remember thinking that this moment was going to cost me something later, even if I didn't know what yet. I walked back to my car slowly, not because I was tired, but because moving faster would have meant admitting I had nowhere to go. The neighborhood was quiet in the curated way nice neighborhoods are, every lawn trimmed, every window dark and judgmental. I sat behind the wheel and didn't start the engine. I just rested my forehead against it and listened to the ticking sound of metal cooling. My phone buzzed with a low battery warning, then another email from a number I didn't recognize. I didn't open it. Some part of me already knew that reading one more piece of bad news would tip something I wouldn't be able to set back upright. That night blurred in pieces rather than hours. A security guard knocked on my window around midnight, polite but firm, telling me I couldn't park there. I apologized too many times and drove until I found a grocery store lot that didn't look monitored. I reclined the seat as far as it would go and wrapped my jacket tighter, the smell of old coffee and upholstery pressing in. I stared at the ceiling fabric and thought about how I used to check on my daughter at night, listening for her breathing, making sure she was warm. I wondered when protection had become a one-way street, and when exactly I had agreed to that. By morning, my body ached in places I didn't know could ache. I drove to a gas station bathroom to splash water on my face, avoiding the mirror until I had no choice. The man looking back at me seemed older than I remembered, eyes rimmed red, jaw clenched like it had been holding something back for years. A cashier offered me a free coffee refill when she noticed my hands shaking. I thanked her and sat by the window pretending to scroll through my phone so no one would ask questions. That was when it hit me. Not the loss of the house or the job, but the certainty that I had crossed into a version of life where explanations were no longer offered, only assumptions made. I didn't call my daughter again. Pride played a role, but it wasn't the whole story. Something in me had shifted on that porch, something quiet but decisive. I told myself it was temporary, that I'd figure things out, that this wasn't the end of anything. Still, a small, steady voice kept reminding me that nights like this redraw boundaries whether you want them to or not. I checked my voicemail again and deleted the bank message without listening. I didn't need details. I already knew where I stood, with institutions, with family, with myself. 2 hours later, just as the sun climbed high enough to expose everything I tried to hide, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Habit told me unknown numbers brought nothing good, and I wasn't sure I had the energy for another polite dismissal. It rang again. I answered with my voice already defensive, already braced. "Hello," I said, staring at the condensation sliding down my coffee cup. There was a pause on the other end, then a breath, steady and deliberate, like someone choosing their words carefully. "It's me," the voice said. "You probably don't remember, but you helped me when everyone else turned away." I closed my eyes, the noise of the gas station fading behind that sentence. At the time, I couldn't have known what that call would change or what it would expose about the people I thought I could count on. I only knew that the night before had stripped something away, and whatever came next would build on that loss, not erase it. I didn't realize then that sleeping in my car wasn't the lowest point. It was just the moment everything else became possible. "I owe you my life," the voice said, steady but weighted, like the words had been carried for years and finally set down. I tightened my grip on the phone and leaned back in the driver's seat as a truck rumbled past the gas station window, its sound briefly drowning out my thoughts. He said my name the way people do when they're afraid it won't be recognized, careful with the syllables, respectful of the history attached to them. I told him he had the wrong number, not because I was sure, but because disbelief felt safer than curiosity. He didn't argue. He just said, "I expected that." And something about that certainty made me listen instead of hanging up. He started with details, not emotion, as if laying evidence on a table. He mentioned a city I hadn't lived in for decades, a job site that had shut down, a rainy Tuesday when I'd found him sitting in his car behind a closed warehouse. As he spoke, fragments stirred. Images without context, a younger version of myself handing someone cash I couldn't afford to lose, telling him it wasn't charity if it kept him standing. I hadn't thought of that moment in years. I told him memory was unreliable, that people confused kindness with obligation all the time. He paused, then said, "You told me to call my daughter every Sunday, even if she didn't answer." I did. She came back. That detail landed hard, precise in a way lies rarely are. I checked the time, the battery percentage, the way people do when they want an excuse to end a conversation. My phone buzzed with another low-power warning, a small but persistent reminder that everything had limits. He told me he'd been looking for me, that life had a way of circling back to unfinished accounts. I laughed then, a short, humorless sound that surprised even me. I told him accounts were settled whether we liked it or not, that people didn't hand out gratitude decades later unless they wanted something. He didn't deny it. He just said, "I want to give you something back." And the way he said back made it sound like a return, not a gift. We spoke for longer than I expected, time stretching in that strange way it does when the past resurfaces. He explained how he'd rebuilt himself, how success had come slowly, earned the hard way, and how guilt had followed him like a shadow because he knew where he would have ended up without that night. I listened, sipping coffee gone cold, watching a woman argue with a pump that refused her card. Every few minutes, the reality of my situation interrupted, an email alert, a stiff ache in my neck, the knowledge that I still had nowhere to sleep that night. And yet, beneath all of it, there was a quiet pull, a sense that this conversation wasn't accidental. I told him I didn't need repayment. The words came out automatically, the reflex of someone who had spent a lifetime minimizing his own needs. I explained my situation briefly, skimming the surface so I wouldn't have to feel the depth of it. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Then let me be clear," and his tone shifted, losing its nostalgia and gaining something firmer. This isn't about pity. This is about balance. He asked me to meet him in person, named a cafe not far from where I was parked, said he'd be there all afternoon if needed. I hesitated, staring at the cracked dashboard, weighing the cost of hope against the comfort of low expectations. I didn't answer right away, and that silence stretched long enough for doubt to take root. I wondered if this was some elaborate misunderstanding, if grief and exhaustion were conspiring to make me reckless. My phone buzzed again, this time a text from my daughter that simply read, "You okay?" It had been sent an hour earlier. I didn't respond. I thought about the porch light, the careful way she'd closed the door, and felt something in me cool. I told the man on the phone I'd think about it. He said, "I'll be here," without pressure, without insistence, and that calm confidence unsettled me more than any plea would have. 2 hours passed before I started the car. I drove aimlessly at first, letting traffic decide for me, then found myself turning toward the cafe without having consciously chosen it. The parking lot was half full, the kind of place people went to linger. I sat there with the engine off, counting breaths, telling myself I could leave at any moment. That thought, that I still had an exit, was enough to get me through the door. The smell of coffee and baked bread wrapped around me, warm and disarming. I scanned the room, expecting disappointment, already preparing for it. Then a man stood and raised his hand, eyes searching until they found mine. He looked older, heavier than the memory I'd reconstructed, but his smile was the same, tentative, grateful, carrying the weight of years. We shook hands, and he held on a second longer than necessary, like he was grounding himself. We ordered without looking at menus, defaulting to habits formed long ago. As we sat, he slid an envelope onto the table, but didn't push it toward me. He talked first, filling the space with context, with the kind of honesty that comes from having nothing left to hide. He told me about the company, about the years he'd spent planning this moment, rehearsing it in his head, fearing I'd be gone when he finally found the courage. I cut him off when he mentioned transferring ownership. I told him that was impossible, that people didn't hand over their livelihoods on a whim. He nodded, unoffended, and opened the envelope just enough for me to see the edge of official-looking documents. My heart picked up speed, not with excitement, but with alarm. This was too much, too fast. He leaned back and said something that has stayed with me since. "You taught me that stability isn't owned, it's stewarded. I'm tired. I want to rest knowing it's in the right hands." The words hit harder than I expected, because they implied a faith in me I wasn't sure I still deserved. A barista called out an order, the sharp sound breaking the moment. I realized my hands were trembling and tucked them under the table. I told him I needed time, that decisions like this couldn't be made over coffee. He agreed easily, as if he'd anticipated resistance. He said he'd give me as much time as I needed, but he added, almost casually, "I've already told my lawyer to prepare everything." That was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath me, not because of the offer itself, but because it was already in motion. Consequences, I was learning, often began before consent. When we parted, he hugged me, an awkward, careful gesture that surprised us both. I walked back to my car feeling heavier, not lighter, as if I'd picked up a responsibility I hadn't agreed to carry. My phone buzzed again, this time with a missed call from a number I recognized too well. I didn't check the voicemail. I sat there instead, watching the cafe door swing open and closed, thinking about how quickly roles could reverse, how invisible lines became walls overnight. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep, that whatever I chose next would redraw my relationships in ways I couldn't undo. And for the first time since that night on the porch, I wasn't sure retreat was still an option. He didn't waste time when I came back the next morning. "Before you say no," he said, sliding a thick folder across the polished table in his office, "I need you to understand why this isn't charity." The room smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and new carpet, the kind of place designed to signal permanence. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a city that looked nothing like the one I'd slept in my car beside just 48 hours earlier. I stayed standing, hands buried in my jacket pockets, because sitting felt like agreement. He watched me carefully, not with hope, but with resolve, like someone braced for resistance but unwilling to retreat. I opened the folder slowly, half expecting it to disappear if I moved too fast. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand but recognized enough to know they were real. Company registration papers, transfer clauses, signatures already in place. My name appeared more than once, typed cleanly, without hesitation. I laughed then, a sharp sound that echoed off the glass. I told him he'd lost perspective, that gratitude had curdled into guilt, and guilt was a terrible reason to make life-altering decisions. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said quietly, "You didn't just give me money. You treated me like I wasn't disposable." That sentence landed harder than anything else because it wasn't something I'd ever given myself credit for. As he spoke, memories rearranged themselves with uncomfortable clarity. I remembered the night I'd found him, how he'd tried to joke his way out of despair, how I'd recognized the look in his eyes because I'd worn it once myself. I remembered telling him that help wasn't a transaction, that survival sometimes required accepting it without shame. At the time, I hadn't thought of it as anything more than decency. Sitting there now, I realized how rarely decency was offered without condition and how long its echo could last when it was. That realization didn't feel good. It felt heavy, like being confronted with a version of myself I'd neglected. A lawyer entered the room without ceremony, nodding at both of us as if this were an ordinary meeting. He began explaining timelines, contingencies, and legal safeguards, his voice smooth and practiced. I caught phrases, effective immediately, full transfer of authority, irrevocable. Each one tightened something in my chest. I interrupted more than once, asking what happened if I walked away, if I refused to sign, if I disappeared again. The lawyer answered professionally, but my friend answered honestly. "Then I'll still be grateful," he said, "but I'll know I tried." That was the moment I understood this wasn't about obligation anymore. It was about trust being offered without leverage. My phone vibrated on the table, a sharp intrusion I hadn't anticipated. A notification preview flashed my daughter's name, followed by a message I didn't open. I flipped the phone face down, suddenly aware of how separate my worlds had become. One part of my life was asking for explanations I wasn't ready to give. Another was offering responsibility I hadn't sought. The contrast made me dizzy. I asked for a break, and no one argued. I stepped into the hallway, the carpet muffling my footsteps, and leaned against a wall until the room stopped spinning. In that quiet, doubts lined up one after another. I questioned my worthiness, my capacity, my right to step into a life that had moved on without me. I told myself this was too much, that accepting it would make me complicit in rewriting my own narrative. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a steady undercurrent of something else, recognition. I had spent years believing my best contributions were behind me, that whatever good I'd done had already been accounted for. This offer challenged that belief, and part of me resisted not because it was wrong, but because it threatened the story I'd told myself to survive. When I returned to the conference room, they were waiting without impatience. I sat this time, the chair firm beneath me, grounding. I asked questions, hard ones, about the company's finances, its people, its vulnerabilities. As answers came, detailed and transparent, my skepticism shifted into something closer to respect. This wasn't a vanity project. It was a living thing, sustained by people who depended on it. The weight of that responsibility settled slowly, not as excitement, but as obligation of the rarest kind, the kind chosen, not imposed. I didn't sign that day. That surprised them, though they hid it well. I asked for 48 hours, a small window to sit with the decision without anyone else's voice in my ear. My friend agreed immediately. "Take the time," he said. "You always did things the right way." The phrase followed me out of the building, echoing in my head as I drove. I realized then how dangerous praise could be when you were vulnerable, how easily it could push you toward choices made for the wrong reasons. I resolved to be careful, not because I distrusted him, but because I needed to trust myself. That night, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, using cash I'd been saving for emergencies. The room was small but clean, the bed too soft, the quiet almost unsettling after the constant hum of my car. I sat on the edge of the mattress and stared at the blank wall, letting the day replay in fragments. I thought about my daughter, about how quickly circumstances might shift if she knew. I thought about the offer, about what it would mean to accept help after being rejected by my own blood. The irony wasn't lost on me. It felt like a test, one I hadn't studied for. Sleep came in fits. Each time I drifted off, I woke with a jolt, convinced I'd made a mistake simply by considering it. By morning, my resolve had sharpened. I realized that refusing the offer wouldn't preserve my dignity the way I'd assumed. It would only reinforce a belief that I wasn't allowed to receive what I'd once given freely. That belief had kept me small for years, quietly limiting what I thought I deserved. Recognizing it didn't erase the fear, but it gave me a reason to move through it. When my phone rang late that morning, I knew before answering who it would be. I let it ring once, twice, then picked up. "I'm ready to talk," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. There was a pause on the other end, then relief, unguarded and genuine. We agreed to meet again that afternoon. As I hung up, I felt the first true shift since the night on the porch. Not hope exactly, but alignment. I didn't know yet how accepting this would change my relationships, or what it would cost me in the end. I only knew that the life I'd been pushed into was no longer asking for my permission. And this time, I intended to answer deliberately. "Dad, why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was light, almost playful, like we were picking up a conversation that had only paused mid-sentence instead of fractured entirely. I stared at my phone when her name flashed across the screen, feeling a tight, unfamiliar calm settle in my chest. She stood in the doorway of my temporary apartment less than an hour later, dressed neatly, smiling wide, holding a bag of pastries like proof of good intentions. She stepped inside without waiting to be invited, her eyes scanning the space as if cataloging it, reassured by what she saw. It struck me then how quickly absence turned into entitlement once circumstances changed. I didn't answer her question right away. I gestured for her to sit, and she did, crossing her legs comfortably, already at ease. She talked instead, filling the silence with updates about her life, her kids, her husband's stressful job, how hard things had been lately. She mentioned neighbors, friends, people who had apparently heard about my new role, as she called it, like it was a promotion I'd forgotten to announce. I listened, nodding occasionally, noticing how carefully she avoided mentioning that night on the porch. The omission was deliberate. It told me everything I needed to know about how she planned to rewrite the past. She framed her earlier refusal as concern, as temporary chaos, as something misunderstood. "You know how he gets when he's under pressure," she said, shrugging lightly, shifting responsibility away from herself with practiced ease. She spoke about optics, about how fragile reputations were, how people judged so quickly. I watched her hands move as she talked, animated and confident, the same hands I'd once held crossing busy streets. The contrast hurt more than I expected, not because she was there now, but because she acted as if she always had been. My phone buzzed on the table between us, a message from a colleague congratulating me on a recent decision. She glanced at it instinctively, curiosity barely masked. "It must feel good," she said, smiling again, "to be back on your feet." The phrase "back on your feet" lingered, implying a fall she'd observed from a safe distance. I wondered if she realized how conditional her warmth felt, how transparently tied to my restored usefulness. I wondered, too, when she decided proximity was something to be earned rather than offered. I told her I hadn't shared the news because I was still processing it myself. That was true, but incomplete. The fuller truth, that her rejection had shifted something fundamental, remained unspoken. She reached across the table then, placing her hand over mine, the gesture rehearsed but effective. "We're family," she said softly. "We stick together." The words echoed strangely in the room, hollowed out by timing. I didn't pull my hand away, but I didn't squeeze back either. Some connections, once loosened, didn't tighten the same way again. Over the next few days, her presence became constant. Texts in the morning, calls in the evening, invitations to dinner framed as reconciliation. Her husband suddenly wanted to talk, to clear the air, to move forward. I declined politely, citing busyness. watching how quickly politeness turned into pressure. Each interaction followed the same pattern: affection layered over expectation, concern trailing subtle requests. She asked about my plans, my finances, the company's future. I answered vaguely, aware of how information could be currency. That awareness was new, and it unsettled me. What surprised me most wasn't her interest, but how public it became. She posted photos from our dinners, captions about proud daughters and strong fathers, narratives that skipped inconvenient chapters. Friends and relatives reached out, congratulating her on my success as if it were a shared accomplishment. I watched my story be reframed in real time. My struggle softened into a temporary setback, my rejection erased entirely. Correcting them would have required explanations I wasn't ready to give. So I stayed silent, letting the discomfort sit, trusting it was teaching me something important. One afternoon, while reviewing documents at my desk, I received an email from her outlining a business idea her husband wanted to discuss. It was phrased carefully, wrapped in optimism, but the implication was clear: access, partnership, opportunity. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, feeling the final pieces fall into place. This wasn't reconciliation. It was repositioning. The clarity that followed wasn't angry or bitter. It was calm, almost relieving. Naming the pattern stripped it of its power. I thought back to the night in my car, to the cold and the silence and the certainty that something had ended. At the time, I'd believed it was stability. Now I understood it was illusion. The people who stayed when you had nothing were few, but they were real. Everyone else adjusted their distance based on what you could offer. Accepting that truth hurt less than pretending otherwise. It allowed me to stop negotiating with my own memory, to trust what I'd felt on that porch instead of doubting it. That evening, my daughter called again. I let it ring, watching the screen light up and fade. For the first time, I didn't feel compelled to explain myself, to smooth things over, to maintain peace at my own expense. The silence wasn't punishment. It was space, necessary and intentional. I knew then that whatever boundary I was approaching would be misunderstood, maybe even vilified. But I also knew it was inevitable. Some decisions announced themselves quietly, not with confrontation, but with withdrawal. And I had already begun. Why are you being so hard on her? My sister's voice came through the phone, sharp and immediate, skipping any pretense of greeting, as if urgency alone justified accusation. I had just sat down at my desk, the late afternoon light slanting across a stack of contracts I was still learning to read with confidence, when her call cut through the room. I asked her what she meant, though I already knew. Silence filled the line for a beat before she exhaled and said, "She's devastated. She says you shut her out completely." The words landed with a dull thud, not because they hurt, but because they confirmed what I'd been bracing for. She told me, piece by piece, the version of events my daughter had shared with the family. In that version, I was distant, proud, unwilling to forgive. I had refused her efforts to reconnect. I had chosen money over relationships. The night on the porch wasn't mentioned at all. Neither was the car, the cold, or the quiet humiliation of being treated like a liability. Listening to it felt like hearing a familiar song with the wrong lyrics, recognizable, but distorted. I didn't interrupt. I let the narrative play out, noting where truth had been omitted rather than twisted, because omission was harder to challenge without sounding defensive. When my sister finished, she waited, expecting rebuttal. I could hear the tension in her breathing, the anticipation of conflict. I told her simply that there was more to the story than she'd been told. She asked why I hadn't explained myself, why I was letting people believe the worst. The question lingered, heavy with expectation. I looked out the window at the street below, watching someone struggle to parallel park, and realized how tired I was of correcting impressions. Because explaining doesn't always bring clarity, I said carefully. Sometimes it just feeds the misunderstanding. She didn't like that answer. I could tell by the way her tone hardened. After we hung up, messages started arriving in waves. Cousins, old friends, even someone I hadn't spoken to since my daughter's wedding. They all carried the same undertone, concern edged with judgment, curiosity masked as care. One asked if I was okay. Another suggested I soften my stance before it was too late. None asked what had happened. The assumption was already set, and my silence had been interpreted as confirmation. I scrolled through them slowly, feeling a familiar urge rise, the need to defend myself, to be seen as reasonable. Recognizing that urge was uncomfortable. Resisting it felt like growth. That evening, I received an email from my daughter. It was long, emotional, carefully structured. She wrote about love, about family, about how hurt she was by my distance. She said she didn't recognize the man I'd become. She said success had changed me. I read it twice, not for content, but for tone. What struck me wasn't anger or sadness, but entitlement, the assumption that access to me was a given, regardless of how I'd been treated when I had nothing. She framed my boundary as betrayal, my silence as punishment. Nowhere did she acknowledge the night she'd turned me away. I drafted a response that night. It was honest, measured, thorough. I explained how that night had felt, how sleeping in my car had recalibrated something in me, how conditional support had changed the way I understood our relationship. I wrote about trust and timing and accountability. When I finished, I read it once, then closed the document without sending it. The relief was immediate and surprising. I realized I didn't want her to understand anymore, not because I was cruel, but because understanding required a willingness she hadn't shown. Sending the message would have been an invitation to debate my pain, and I was done negotiating its validity. The next day, a colleague mentioned casually that he'd heard about the family situation. The way he said it, gentle, careful, made it clear the story had traveled beyond personal circles. I smiled politely and redirected the conversation back to work. Later, alone in my office, I sat with the realization that my reputation was now being shaped by someone else's narrative. The instinct to intervene flared again, but this time it was weaker. I understood then that control was an illusion I'd been clinging to. People would believe what aligned with their comfort. My job wasn't to convince them otherwise. Over the following week, the requests changed. They became subtler, framed as reconciliation but carrying practical implications. A suggestion that I help with tuition. A mention of a business expense that could use guidance. Each message ended with affection, as if love were the currency used to soften the ask. I declined each one politely, without explanation. The responses cooled quickly. Affection receded when utility was denied. The pattern repeated itself often enough that it stopped surprising me. Instead, it clarified something I'd been avoiding. Boundaries didn't create distance, they revealed it. One afternoon, I ran into a former neighbor at a cafe. She congratulated me warmly, then lowered her voice and said she hoped things worked out with my daughter. The assumption embedded in that hope, that I was the obstacle, no longer stung. I thanked her and changed the subject, feeling oddly steady. The need to correct had faded. In its place was a quiet certainty that my version of events didn't need witnesses to be valid. That certainty felt like a turning point, one I sensed would lead to a decision that couldn't be undone. That night, as I organized old files at home, I found a photo of my daughter as a child, missing 2 front teeth, grinning without reservation. I sat on the floor and let myself feel the grief I'd been postponing, not for the relationship as it was, but for what I'd believed it to be. The loss was real, and it deserved acknowledgement. But grief didn't require surrender. I understood then that closure wouldn't come from confrontation or validation. It would come from choosing what I was willing to carry forward and what I was finally ready to leave behind. I blocked her number while sitting in the same car I'd once slept in, parked in the quiet lot behind my new apartment building. Engine off, windows down just enough to let the evening air move through. The irony wasn't lost on me. The car had gone from shelter to symbol, from desperation to reminder. My phone rested heavy in my hand as I stared at her name one last time, thumb hovering, mind steady. There was no anger in the moment, no rush of vindication. Just a calm acceptance that whatever relationship we had existed now only as memory, and memory alone couldn't be allowed to keep injuring the present. I didn't arrive at that decision suddenly. It had been forming since the porch, since the careful way she'd chosen optics over compassion, since the warmth that returned only after my circumstances changed. Blocking her wasn't punishment. It was protection. I understood, Finally, that continuing contact would mean endless explanations, ongoing negotiations of my boundaries, and a quiet erosion of the self-respect I'd only recently recovered. The man who'd slept in his car had learned something essential about his limits, and I wasn't willing to unlearn it just to make others more comfortable. The next morning, I went into the office early, the building still half asleep, lights dim, hallways quiet. I liked those hours best. Before expectation, before interruption. I placed my keys on the desk and sat down, taking a moment to absorb the reality of where I was. 30 years earlier, I'd helped someone without knowing it would come back to me like this. Now, I carried a responsibility I intended to honor, not as a reward, but as a continuation of who I'd always been when I wasn't trying to prove anything. Work grounded me in ways emotion couldn't. Decisions were clear. Consequences were visible. Integrity mattered. I found comfort in that structure, in the idea that effort still led somewhere tangible. Each small success reinforced the truth that my worth had never been tied to my daughter's approval or anyone else's validation. I had built a life once before. I was doing it again, this time without apologizing for taking up space. Messages from family slowed, then stopped altogether. Silence replaced tension, and in that quiet, I discovered something unexpected: relief. I no longer felt the need to rehearse conversations that wouldn't happen or brace myself for accusations disguised as concern. The absence hurt less than the presence ever had. It gave me room to think clearly, to grieve honestly, to move forward without dragging unresolved expectations behind me like chains. I signed a lease that week. Nothing extravagant, just a place that felt mine. The act of writing my name on that paper stirred something deep and steady in my chest. I cooked my first meal there alone, ate at the counter, and noticed how peaceful it felt not to perform for anyone. No one judging my choices. No one reframing my story. Just me, present and intact. It struck me then that independence wasn't about isolation. It was about agency, the right to choose who had access to your life. Occasionally, guilt tried to surface, wearing the familiar mask of obligation. I acknowledged it without letting it drive. I reminded myself that being a parent didn't mean surrendering dignity, that love didn't require enduring disrespect. I had given freely for decades: time, money, patience, forgiveness. Drawing a line now didn't erase that history. It honored it by refusing to let it be exploited. I kept the photo of my daughter as a child, but I moved it to a drawer instead of my desk. Not out of spite, but out of honesty. I needed to relate to who she was, not who I wished she'd remained. Letting go of the fantasy hurt more than losing the relationship itself, but it was also the most freeing act I'd performed in years. You can't build the future while clinging to a version of the past that no longer exists. As weeks turned into months, my life settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Mornings with purpose, evenings with quiet, friendships that didn't fluctuate based on my usefulness. I noticed how my shoulders sat lower, how my breath came easier. Healing, I learned, wasn't loud or dramatic. It was subtle and cumulative, built from choices made consistently, even when no one was watching. I didn't lose my family that night on the porch. I lost the illusion that love could exist without respect. And in exchange, I gained something far more valuable: clarity, self-trust, and the courage to choose myself without apology. I was pushed too far, quietly and deliberately, and when I finally stood up for myself, I didn't do it with anger. I did it with finality. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been rejected when you were most vulnerable, or judged only after you recovered, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear they're allowed to choose themselves, and subscribe to the channel for more real stories about boundaries, betrayal, and finding strength when family fails you. See you soon in the next story.